With the debate around so-called work requirements and other proposals to take healthcare, food, and housing away from struggling workers continuing to rage on in Washington and in states across the country, an article in the Washington Post this week takes a look at some of the origins of these types of proposals, tracing them all the way back to the state of Wisconsin, which in many ways was ground zero of quote-unquote welfare reform, long before President Clinton signed it into law in 1996. I'm pleased to speak with Robert Samuels, whose article is titled "Wisconsin is the GOP Model for Welfare Reform, but as work requirements grow, so does one family's desperation." Robert is a national political reporter with the Washington Post who covers how policies in Washington affect the lives of everyday Americans. Robert, thanks so much for joining the show.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
So your recent piece is getting a lot of attention. The title is "Wisconsin is the GOP Model for, quote, welfare reform, but as work requirements grow, so does one family's desperation." I'd love to start by just asking, what got you interested in reporting this story?
Coming into 2018, I noticed that lots of Republicans on the Hill were talking about, after tax reform, the next thing they wanted to tackle was the social safety net. And it became very clear when you started looking across the state, across the 50 states, that there was a movement going on in lots of places in terms of refining and restricting the welfare, the package that we now call welfare, things like food stamps, Medicaid, public housing. And so I really wanted to know what it must be like to be on one of those programs or need one of those programs and live in a state where it's becoming harder and harder.
And it's becoming harder and harder in Wisconsin, in particular, where your story is set, because of very specific bills that haven't gotten a ton of national attention, that in a lot of ways look like the proposals we're now seeing move through Congress, being advanced by Republicans in particular. And the story goes back to 2013. Tell a little bit of the story of some of what Wisconsin's been up to when it comes to cutting programs that help families make ends meet.
Absolutely. During that time, this story sort of flew a little under the radar because everyone was so focused on what Governor Scott Walker was doing with public sector unions. But along with that, he put a time restriction that limited the amount of time a person can receive food stamps if they weren't working. If you are able-bodied and had no children, Scott Walker pushed legislation that would limit your time on food stamps to 3 months. And after those 3 months, you had to show some sort of work-related activity, which means you had to have a job for at least 20 hours a week or go to a training program to show that you wanted a job.
And that's a policy that has been in the law that authorizes the food stamp program, now called SNAP, for a long time. But a lot of states had actually gotten waivers from that because of the recession and high unemployment. So this was him putting that back into place and in a pretty harsh way. But that's not the only piece of legislation that he's moved.
No, that's not. And Scott Walker was at the forefront about restricting or reversing the lift of those waivers that you saw that were so popular during the Obama administration. This February, Scott Walker gave a State of the State address and said that he wanted to call a special session about welfare reform. And in that, he proposed 10 new restrictions that would limit or reform the social safety net as we know it. That work requirement for able-bodied single adults that I spoke about earlier was broadened to families. The number of hours that a person had to work was raised from 20 to 30. All of a sudden, if you owe child support, you're no longer eligible for Medicaid. There was drug testing for public housing. There had already been a move to get drug testing for food stamps. And in the case of one of the characters in our story, what really struck them was an asset limitation that said if you have a car that's worth more than $20,000, you can no longer be eligible to apply for food stamps.
Which, of course, is lots of folks, right, who have just a little bit of money in the bank or maybe even a really cheap car. But it would mean having to drain their savings or get rid of that vehicle that helps them get to work, also that they can be eligible for basic food. So this was a package of 9 so-called welfare reform bills that ultimately passed through Wisconsin's legislature. And And of course, Scott Walker's direct quote about why he's doing all of this: for those who are able, public assistance should be a trampoline, not a hammock. We've heard that before. But this isn't the first time that Wisconsin has sort of led the way in terms of finding new ways to take away basics from people who are struggling to make ends meet that other policymakers end up seeing and wanting to take and make their own. The story actually goes back to the 1990s, as your piece tells.
Right. Actually, in sort of the history of the idea of welfare reform, it starts in Wisconsin. A governor named Tommy Thompson was the first person who talked about time limiting Governor Tommy Thompson was the first person who talked about time limiting what was then called welfare, which we now call cash assistance, or TANF. A president named Bill Clinton saw this idea and he thought it was great and modeled it for the federal welfare reform that was taken and propped up by Republicans and Democrats in the Congress at the time.
And Wisconsin, in a lot of ways, isn't just ground zero of what became, quote unquote, welfare reform because of specific policies that the governor was championing. There were other people involved who became sort of architects of this movement, one of whom was the Secretary of Welfare at the time in the state.
That's right.
So take us to present day. What do we know about what happened after these policies were put into place? Republicans often look to them and they say, this is the way to get people to work. They wrap everything up in sort of puppies and rainbows language about promoting work and helping families get the kick in the butt that they maybe need. That's sort of the language we often hear. But what do we know about what actually happened after we saw these policies go into effect?
Well, in 1996, on the national level, what we saw was there was a lot of interest in how this would work, and the federal government commissioned a study, a 5-year look at a bunch of welfare programs, in which they had a group that was subjected to these new requirements and a control group. And what they found was initially very encouraging. During the first 2 years of that evaluation, they saw families who were subjected to work requirements, they got jobs faster, and their incomes were rising faster. And it looked like a success. But toward the 5th year, something really unusual started to happen in their mind. Those gains were lost, and families who were in that control group, who were not subjected to work requirements, their employment numbers were about the same. Their income numbers were actually a little bit higher, not statistically so, but a little bit higher. And it appeared that long term, it did not make that much of a difference, and it highlighted the idea that the bigger problem might be jobs, and the fact that people were living in community where there was not access to good-paying, consistent jobs that were year-round and not seasonal. In Wisconsin, what we saw was super interesting. For most people who believe in these welfare requirements, it's charted as a success because they will tell you, and the numbers show this, that 25,000 people found work after they were sanctioned because they went through the training program that the state of Wisconsin had encouraged them to go to. What the state doesn't really talk about as much is the fact that 86,000 of those 86,000 people who are on food stamps, they did not report getting a new job when they were sanctioned. And no one knows what happened to them. And the state's not looking. They presume, with no evidence, that some of those people found a new job. The opponents and the hunger advocates would say that's very wishful thinking.
So you end up having all this focus on this 25,000 number, which sounds really great without any context. Of course, that's out of a statewide total of 700,000 people that we're talking about here, right? So folks can do the math in terms of what kind of a percentage that is. But you've got way more than 3 times the number of people who ended up actually finding work at whatever point in time this was getting measured, who aren't necessarily better off, who the state isn't aware have found work and who are now just hungrier.
Yeah. Well, the 25,000 to 700,000 ratio isn't, I think, too fair because not all those people were subject to the requirements. These are single-bodied able adults. The 700,000 number includes families and includes people who are disabled and like that. So it's not truly apples to apples, but the 25,000 to 86,000 is fairly comparable because there are people in the same bucket. And the 86,000, what really struck me about that number was there wasn't much interest from the state level to figure out what the issue was with these people and why they couldn't find jobs. For those who are in the business of feeding people, that's a strange way of putting it, but people who run food pantries, people in churches and homeless shelters who feel a moral obligation to feed the hungry and feed the sick, they're wondering, well, gee, how are we going to be able to feed all these people? The numbers of folks who need the help, in some cases, have quintupled since those work requirements were initiated in 2013.